And now, a workshop of the McAllen City Commission. All workshops are open to the public in accordance with the Texas Open Meetings Act. These workshops allow for detailed staff presentations.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the workshop of June 12, 2023 from the McAllen Board of Commissioners. We do apologize for the delay. We didn't quite reach quorum until about a minute ago at 4:13. Mr. City Manager.
Mayor Pro Tem, members of the Commission, thank you. As we've discussed, we are in the midst of making quite a bit of changes with the Animal Control Division of our city, its operations, and the animal welfare in general. And so one of the things that I had asked the City Commission to consider is to bring in someone that I met a couple of months ago that was really in line with the things that we want to do here in the city of McAllen. And it's going to be a different way of doing business. So I asked her to come in, invited her to be part of our workshop. She's an expert, as far as I'm concerned, in the United States. She comes from Florida. Her name is Dr. Sarah Pisano. We have her here, and back then I asked her to come in to present to you. We also have Faith Wright from the Palm Valley Animal Society. Together, they had a very impactful meeting with us, and I thought that it was something that you should hear. And credit to the communities around us, because they were not only were they at that meeting, but I invited them here today. I've got representatives from the City of Mission, the City Manager from the City of FAR, a representative from Hidalgo County, and I believe from Edinburgh. Yes, from the City of Edinburgh. So thank you all for being here as part of the workshop to listen to what we're proposing, because if you agree that the changes that we propose are something we want to do, we really need to do it in a regional approach. Animals, whether they're dogs or cats or anything else, don't know where city limit lines are, or the county or the city. And so I think that together, if we take this approach, much like we are taking the possible facility that we want to build for the city of McAllen, we can be successful. And so with that, I'm going to step back and let the experts talk to you about some of the things that we should consider.
And before we begin that, I just have a real quick question. Is there any member of the board that has any question for staff regarding an agenda item? I forgot to ask that. No. If not, we'll proceed. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And my name is Dr. Sarah Pisano. After graduating vet school in 1994, I've committed my entire career to animal sheltering and welfare. And 6 years of that was serving as director of Miami-Dade Animal Services. So I'm very familiar with the framework with which you are all providing public and animal safety. And in the last 10 years, I have concentrated on doing consults for communities all around the United States. In fact, I started coming to your community in 2016. I think this is my 7th trip that I've been involved in some way. Our team has raised money to help Palm Valley with some veterinary teams that came in to help. We came in 2019 and we tested 800 dogs for distemper to help get over that very serious viral load. So I am thrilled and honored to be able to talk to you today and say things that I certainly was not saying in the 90s. Or even maybe 2005 when I was public shelter director. So I ask that everybody just have an open mind, because as we move forward, we see other programs that are more successful than ours. We have research, we have data, that something's taking over the computer now. It's a poltergeist. Hold on. Oh, okay. Oh, because my presentation is supposed to be up there. Thank you. Thank you so much. Perfect. Let me just move this over. And so I've now done over 130 of these consults. Let me try to hide this. Sometimes if we... Sure. And in fact, my first consult was here in the great state of Texas in Waco. So your state is very special to me, and a lot of my work has been concentrated in Texas. But you can see those blue states, so 24 states around the country. And the message that I want you to hear is this. It doesn't matter if I am in a community with 2 million people or 2,000 people. It doesn't matter what state I'm in. Every challenge with respect to providing public and animal safety in the context of animal control, all the challenges are the same.
Sorry.
That's okay. Told you just got to get the hook when you want me to start talking, because I could keep going.
That's not showing up on this screen.
Yeah, I think they're controlling it back here.
Let me check with him. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm going to keep going.
Yeah, keep going.
So the challenges that your animal control officers are facing in the field, what Palm Valley is facing in the shelter, all the same. And what happened is, as I was going to all these shelters and hearing the same challenges, but at the same time seeing programs that were successful, I started sharing, our team started sharing, hey, this is what they're doing, and it worked great. And that's how we became a very impactful consultation program. And I found myself writing the same exact recommendations no matter where I was in the country. And little by little, as these programs and ideas were adopted, it was transformational. And I'm talking about thousands and thousands less animals going into shelters. In 18 of the first shelters that I did, we looked at the euthanasia rate. Back then, there was a lot more euthanasia in shelters than there is now. In 18 of those shelters, with no additional budget, staffing, or building size, there were 47,000 less euthanasias. So that has to raise a flag and say, wait a minute, because we all thought this is about money, right? We need bigger buildings, we need more staff, we need more money. Wrong. We need to look at this broken system that we are trying to work within and figure out what makes sense. And what I tell people who are new to animal welfare, if something doesn't make sense, it's because it doesn't make sense. And that is proven true over and over. So I actually published the best practice playbook for animal shelters. I just gifted it to the city of McAllen. But this was the report that I was writing over and over again. Not anything that I made up, but just the industry standards. And so the recommendations, again, are not mine or my team's. They are what we consider the standards through the Association of Shelter Veterinarians, the Million Pet Challenge, which is one of the Maddie's is one of the largest funders, Human Animal Support Services, which you might be familiar with, that started as a result of the pandemic because we didn't know what to do in shelters at the beginning of the pandemic, right? And it's really this idea that at the beginning of the pandemic, communities actually cared for animals. Animals couldn't go into shelters. Either it was very limited admission or shelters were closed. And what we saw was communities taking care of communities, which we had been recommending all along. And when you think about the landscape of animals in the United States, 180-something million pets in the United States, 3% are going into shelters, right? So there's a very small percent, but boy, can it waste a lot of your money if you're not doing it right, and animals and people can suffer as a result. So the system of animal control and sheltering with respect to public and animal safety is a system that was created 150 years ago to round up dangerous dogs and warehouse them until they were inhumanely euthanized. And we've been trying for a long time to fit life-saving in that system, and it's a struggle when you have all these conflicting goals, if you will. So we now know that there's a better way, and that's what I want to talk to you about. So again, I mentioned the dramatic decreases in intake when the shelters that we work with, or even that we haven't worked with, look at how we can decrease intake. And so this matters to the city of McAllen for several reasons. One is, when people are calling, what are they calling for, and what is our response? I can promise you that many of the calls you're receiving for enforcement are in fact a lack of access to veterinary care. But because we have set our system up as a reactive system, we never, and I can promise you when I was public shelter director, not once did I ever ask somebody what they needed, but I certainly judged them. If they were leaving an animal in a shelter, well, you're a bad person, let me take that pet. And that's how we behaved. And so fast forward, we know that there's great opportunity to help. We know we have studies that show even up to 86% or more of people don't want to surrender their pets. They just didn't have the temporary care that they needed. They had no other options. And in animal welfare, we certainly didn't provide those resources. And so I look at Palm Valley. When I was here the first time, they handled 30,000 animals a year. Since that time, they have not taken on all the contracts that they used to take on, and they're doing amazing proactive work that I'm going to tell you about. And this last year, 12,000 animals. So as a city and part of that intake, you have to ask yourself, do we want to work in a proactive way that's always going to be more cost effective and efficient and be much more beneficial for people and animals? Or do we want to stay on this hamster wheel of reactivity? So that example is actually what's happened at your shelter, from 30,000 animals to 12,000. I do a lot of work also in Kentucky. I started helping a shelter in 2019, and this example is in particular with cats, and there's a better way, and here's these pathways. They were taking in 1,200 cats a year, 1,200 cats a year. In 2021, they took in 19 cats the whole year. So again, as a municipality, do I want to house 1,200 cats, or do I want to house 19 cats in a year, right? So when you have this data, this is the power that you have and the responsibility and obligation to understand this data and the potential that you have. And it does also involve enforcement calls. Prevention, there's a lot of shelters. Memphis, Tennessee is one. Those calls for any animal, even a dog at large, goes through the Pet Resource Center. Why? Because that director says, I know it's going to cost me $309 if that pet comes in the building. So guess what? We're going to help that person up to $300, and it's going to be cheaper for us in the long run, right? And then the last one is just the wasting of resources, right? That we just get in this habit because our systems are generally set up for failure. So when we think about resources, there are many different resources that I want you to consider. Certainly a shelter and that finite space is very important, but it's staff. It's far beyond money. It's staffing. It's what your staff is doing. It's not just the number of staff. Certainly money, you have to be at baseline budget, but your partnerships, how are you capitalizing and on collaboration? And I'm so happy to hear and know the city manager is very interested in collaboration with a regional program and building on that. But in animal welfare, we tend to focus very much in a scarcity mindset. So we don't have this and we don't have that and we don't have enough. We have to look at what we have and work within that. And that's why when I talk about the successes that our consults have had, it's because we help those shelters with the resources that they had, just using them a little bit differently. And when you look at maybe a capital project, again, you better have your programs and practices and policies in shape. Because I can't tell you how many shelters that I've visited that are now way oversized or maybe not designed appropriately for how we operate today. So it is crucial that moving forward, if there is, and I hope there will be, a regional capital project, that all of these policies, not just for the city of McAllen, but all the municipalities, adopt these common sense approaches to help your constituents. So for just the city of McAllen, Faith has done such an amazing job capturing this data for you, and for each of the municipalities that Palm Valley Animal Society contracts with. And this is one of the most powerful slides that I can even imagine, is that, looking at the delta of the animals that did not come into the shelter and how much that saved your city. You still have potential to work and help people in different ways. We talked about it today with Michelle and Nancy in terms of calls coming into the center. I'm lucky to be involved in these great feasibility studies in 3 different places in the country. One is Hays County, Texas. And the idea is all calls come into a pet resource center. All calls get filtered, no different than social services. Now we're going to see, okay, what do you need? And that is exclusive from the true public and animal safety call, which may be a bite, attack, a dangerous dog, a rabies case, something like that. Those are true enforcement cases, and that's what you need to reserve your field services team for, true enforcement. But these numbers are very powerful. I use them as examples all over the country to show other municipalities the potential. So very important that no different in a hospital for people, right? Is the surgeon answering the phone? The surgeon could answer the phone. The surgeon can mop the floors. The surgeon could, cook food. Yes. But can anyone else do surgery besides the surgeon? No. So you need to reserve your ACOs for those skilled cases, enforcement, investigations, things like that, and not be, for example, which you're not doing anymore, thank you, is transporting owner surrenders. That should only be done if there's an emergency, and Palm Valley needs the opportunity to see what people need, right? And then, obviously our neglect and hoarding. I also gave a great example today from a community that I worked with in Florida, Marion County, Florida. They got a call, the director gets a call. There's a house with 500 cats. I'm not sure what happened to the owner, if it was a death or a Baker Act, but what have you. Those cats did not go into the shelter because that director collaborated with local, regional, and national organizations, and not one cat came into the shelter. So these are also ways that we're looking at working together. And now, I remember when I was designing the building in Miami, 37,000 animals coming into that shelter a year. And a commissioner said, and we're building a new building, is it going to be big enough? And I wasn't trying to be a smart aleck, but my question to her was, big enough for what? You can't house 37,000 animals, and hold them all, right? It's just not possible, right? So, and nor is it the right thing to do. Access to veterinary care, I'm sorry to tell you, is a crisis in your community and every other community across the country. This is an industry-wide crisis with veterinarians. And then you put on top of that, there's a lot of corporate businesses purchasing veterinary practices, and so we don't have opportunity to work with them on programs that could perhaps increase access to care. Woven into that is access to spay-neuter. So again, I do think that most Americans at this point in time in 2023, it's the norm to have your pet sterilized. And the problem is we don't have enough low-cost opportunities, and sometimes we don't even have enough expensive opportunities, or at a regular private practice. The other thing that came out of the pandemic, and I referred to it before, the human animal support services, is this idea that, what did I just tell you? 3% of all the animals in the United States go to shelters. Less than 5 million animals are going into shelters. And guess what? Most of the time when people need to find, they can't keep their pet for whatever reason, they are finding their pet a home. Most of the time, that's what happens. So at the beginning of the pandemic, we're like, let's put that on, on a rocket ship, and it's called supportive self-rehoming. So it means that we're going to connect you with people who are looking to adopt virtually so that the pet doesn't have to come in the shelter. That's a whole nother rabbit hole of negative consequences for animals and people, including wasting resources, increased risk of infectious disease, overcrowding, all of that. And that's why if they do come in the shelter, we need to make sure we get them out as soon as possible. You might say, well, we don't run the shelter. What's it to us? Well, what if you did have one of those large cases and the shelter has to close because of an infectious disease because they are overcrowded, right? So the shortest length of stay is really, really important. I know that your community, and thank you for this, has been doing community cat programs for a while, but this might be a little foreign to some of you, so I just wanted to go over a couple of important points. This is from the most recent research that shows that the community cat programs that I'm talking about work, and there's just endless amounts of research. But the blue and the green, those are cats that have access to the outdoors. So you can see that takes up most of the pie. The ones going into the shelter are that little tiny sliver. So in your community, it's even lower. But this is going into a shelter and ... when you're a cat outside makes no sense. And this is why. We live differently with dogs than we do with cats. And about half of cat owners allow their cats access to the outside. And so why we trained people to take a cat that they see outside to the shelter, I'll never know, right? So half of people let their cats outside. Those cats aren't lost, but yet we somehow have convinced people way back when that the cats are lost. Okay, so we said take them to the shelter, and that's where they're going to get reunited with their families. Love it. It's such a warm and fuzzy. We all want that to happen. But guess what happens in reality when we actually have data? Because when these ordinances were written 30 years ago, we didn't have this data. Less than 2% of the cats entering shelters are reunited with their families. So you have to ask yourself, if my car didn't start 98% of the time, am I going to do something different? Of course I am. But why do we have public policy that continues to fail 98% of the time? Doesn't make sense, right? I want to mention for dogs, nationally, 22% of sheltered dogs are reunited. And so that means that as our ACOs are taking those dogs at large, not aggressive, not by just they're out and about, to the shelter, nationally 22% of those dogs are going to be reunited with their families. But for the city of McAllen dogs, it's only 13%. Now, Palm Valley, now the burden of placement, another placement when the dog already had a home, is now on Palm Valley and may somehow ripple and affect your municipality as well. So that's why the recommendation is for non-enforcement, non-emergency dogs and cats. Do not pick them up, and reserve the ACOs again for true enforcement cases. Reserve the shelter for animals that don't have other options. And so when cats, back to those cats that are outside, we actually want them to bypass the shelter, go to spay neuter, and get put back right where they were already, where they were picked up. Notice I didn't say found, because they weren't lost to begin with. In 2005, when I was public shelter director in Miami, I did not agree with this program because I said, I don't know who's feeding them. I can't just put them out and not know who's going to feed them dinner tonight. And I think I had a dream one night, and this 12-pound cat, that's a big, healthy cat, was saying, like, do I look like I'm starving, lady? Like, right? I'm 12 pounds. And I thought, oh my God, you're right. Like, I don't know, you're smarter than me. You know where, and if you know cats, they're smarter than people. They're going to your house for breakfast, your house for lunch, and your house for dinner. And you all think that it's your cat. So keep on going. More power to you, right? Right? I know when people laugh that they know, right? So this is the Danville boil. I already told you this example of going from 1,200 to 19 cats in the shelter a year. And then this is just some really great data and links about that program. And just a note on what targeted spay-neuter means. So we have this spay-neuter capacity. We have a veterinary crisis. We have a veterinary shortage. Now we have to look at spay-neuter and say, holy cow, we got to figure out priority. Who is the priority? So in your shelter and every other one, large dogs and cats that are outside have to be your priorities. And that means like your smaller breeds, anything below like 25 pounds, they would get pushed out because number one, most of the time they're not ending up in a shelter. And if they end up in the shelter, they're there for minutes, right? It's the large guys. Then you look at the litters coming from the little ones. They have 2 cute little poodles. And then you look at the big ones and they're having 13, right? So for those reasons, you really have to prioritize large dogs because you can't be everything to everyone. Targeting large dogs. Fixed income pet owners, we are now looking at a little differently because we know there's such a huge access to care need with people living in poverty and even middle income owners. So we're not as strict as we used to be about that, but your high intake areas, for example. And we're looking at field services to have more of a community minded approach rather than a punitive approach that has never and will never work to really solve this whole pathway to nowhere, to negative consequences. But best investment for municipalities. So this is Jacksonville, Florida. The city was taking in a whole lot of animals and euthanizing most of them way back when. And now they haven't euthanized for space in many, many years. But the green is the spay-neuter clinic that said, we want to end euthanasia in our community. We're going to work with the nonprofit clinic and the city shelter, and we're going to figure it out. So the green is the number of spay-neuters, and the purple and the red is intake and euthanasia. So look at Jacksonville, Florida. Look at that pattern, and look at Waco, Texas. Same exact pattern. So you can see how it directly correlates, well, inversely correlates, right? So the more targeted spay-neuters you do, the less intake, and therefore euthanasia. With cats, we've seen communities, there was one in California when they started this program like I described, and cats went instead to spay-neuter and got returned where they were already cared for. They decreased enforcement calls by 90%. I mean, who doesn't want to do that, right? In Huntsville, Alabama, the reason I added that slide is the orange is the flatter line at the bottom, and they don't have a high volume spay-neuter clinic. So again, your capacity is stretched here, and so yours might look like more of that line, but it will still reduce intake, reduce enforcement calls when you target appropriately. It would just take longer, right? So, and then in your package you have this page as well, which is just a bunch of references and resources if you're interested in reading more. But I'm available virtually by phone, email, text, however, if you have additional questions. But I'd like to open it up for questions if anybody has any questions or comments.
Yeah, I have some questions.
Sure.
First, I'd like to start off that I'm much in support of changing our practices and how we operate. The questions I'm going to ask primarily come from the types of questions we get, and I think the way the community would respond to some of this. First off, you went through the example of the 500 cats at a home, right? Gave the impression it turned out well, but where did these cats go? Because I don't think having 500 cats in any home would be satisfactory to any neighbor, right? So were they moved out and given to organizations? Did she keep a small number? How did this pan out?
Yes, so the cats, yes, it was not appropriate to have 500 cats, nor was it going to be moving forward. So the cats that moved to other shelters or rescue groups for adoptions. Most of the cats were healthy. Sometimes in that kind of situation, half the cats might need to be euthanized, but it wasn't the case in that situation. But organizations took anywhere between 10 or 20 or 50 cats, and then they got adopted from there. She was allowed to keep, actually, now that you mention it, she was allowed to keep a few that were spayed and neutered, and they followed up with her and we're not going to allow you to have any more, cats because of that history.
Okay. And going to kind of the neighborhood cat program, I defend it many times in the community. But what tends to sometimes happen is the person that, let's say, is the one that's feeding all the cats, right? Or there's always a main home or a main house, right, where a lot of cats seem to matriculate and seem to breed. Unfortunately, the person that believes they're doing the most care for the cats is usually the one that's the least responsible for the frustration of the surrounding neighbors, right? So how do you deal in a situation where you have that? What would you do, right? They might not voluntarily take them to spay and neuter, or they don't have the resources, right? So what?
Right. So in that situation, I'm a homeowner and I'm a cat lover. So it's not acceptable for me to have a cat spray in my house. No. So this is about not only being a responsible pet owner or cat owner, but respectful to neighbors. And so the real key is helping that person spay neuter before there's X number, exponential numbers. And I think that's where there's some people struggling because of your spay neuter capacity. Also if there are kittens, get the parents spayed and neutered and remove the kittens. And in terms of the neighbors, actually, there's typically multiple people letting their cats in and out and what have you. But usually if cats are going on a property, there's something that's attracting. Like, I'm feeding my cat and I don't want the other cat there or what have you. But you're right. When the numbers get too high, everybody gets in trouble, cats and people. The idea is we need to spay and neuter them, and that's the challenge.
That is the challenge. On one of your slides, you had not the non-enforcement dogs at large. Is this not to pick up the strays that people see or worry about, the ones that running around with collars that obviously look lost? We just don't pick them up?
Right. So this is it's a pet resource center call. So number one, have you seen the dog before? Do you know where the dog lives? Could you potentially, and I'm not talking about anybody who is aggressive or growled or has a history of biting or anything like that. That's an ACO, goes out and picks up the dog. So maybe they have a collar. They can get it checked for a chip. I think you are all doing, you have the chips in fire stations yet? So they can go to a veterinarian or what have you there's some communities that are putting the microchip scanners in fire stations and police stations. So Good Samaritans can have them checked for identification and chips. And then can you hold on to them and try to find their owners? Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes it's no. And then there's a decision on should that dog come in or not. And a lot of times it's a dog that they've seen in the neighborhood or they know where it lives. But I know that is a tough transition, but what we know is, right here in Texas, there's 3 studies that show the dogs that were labeled as stray that went into the shelters were in their neighborhoods, very close to home. And yes, and this is another effective thing that field services teams are doing. So again, I mentioned for the city of McAllen, you're taking these dogs out of their neighborhood. A lot of people don't even know the shelter exists. So the idea is to leave a door hanger on a few doors if you do take the dog to the shelter and say, hey, we found a dog, here's the description. And then other field services teams are doing like the yard sale signs, like, hey, found a dog, because those owners are probably walking around looking for their dog.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times we see stray dogs and they look like they know where they're at, what they're doing, right? But I was thinking of like a little groomed Yorkie with a cute collar, right? Do we not dispatch for that? I mean, it's obviously...
It's case by case. I would say case by case, but in general, you don't, like now these other communities are not, like I was just in Anderson County, South Carolina, they don't pick up dogs at large unless they're confined or enforcement. Yeah.
Okay.
And don't forget too, remember there was a very long period of time from the beginning of 2020 when it was emergency pickup only. And so we didn't see more bites. We didn't see more hit by cars. We didn't see those issues, and that's why I think that's where this recommendation came from, along with the studies.
And big picture, spay neuter has always been the solution, right? The hardest solution to get to. So even with the spay neuter clinics and the low cost spay neuter clinic, even for the residents who attempt to be proactive, appointments can be 4, 5, 6 months out,
Yes.
right? So then how do we cross that bridge, right? I mean, how do we cross the bridge of if we set up all these practices and all these procedures, whether the animals are in the shelter or on the street, we're not reducing the number, right? So
Right. So, but what I want you to think about too is putting them in the shelter. When we think about, it's only 3%, like it's just such a small percent slice of who's out there. So putting them in the shelter isn't making a big impact on like, oh, if we don't spay neuter them from the shelter, then we're going to have this population explosion. But you're right, and it is a challenge, and that's why I think the prioritizing those few appointments that we can get are important. Faith and her team have worked so hard. There's vets flying in here from other parts of the country.
Yes.
Frequently. Sometimes they're here to do the shelter animals. Sometimes they're here to do as many community animals as possible. The more you can have those types of events, the better for your community.
but the ultimate solution would be to have 3, 4 permanent vets in our area, right?
Yeah.
Ideally, just doing spay neuter
Yeah.
constantly, maybe a mobile spay neuter bus, right, to go out to some of the rural areas.
Yeah, I'm actually a fan of a brick and mortar spay neuter, or there's a spay neuter clinic that's not used at large at the Andrews Center. So, but I think a spay neuter unit, the bus, I think it's an asset that depreciates, and I definitely recommend brick and mortar versus that. But I think the vets, yes, for sure.
And Commissioner, what we're thinking about that, obviously, one of the reasons that we wanted the two of them here is there's a lot of things, there's a lot of elements to animal welfare, right? That's one of them, and that's probably one of the most important. And so when we move on down the road, and this is probably not short term, but hopefully midterm, we've got to spend more money in those kinds of
Actions.
There
Yeah.
you go. Those kinds of actions instead of just continuing to put dogs and cats in trucks.
Agreed.
And so every dollar that we spend on being proactive is going to save us, on the back end. And so all of these things together are what we're hoping that we can do as a community.
Isn't kind of the low-hanging fruit here a policy change in terms of stopping the picking up of so many cats, that we could have started to do years ago, but starting to do now, and then when it comes to dogs, maybe changing our method, or our processes so that we're drastically limiting. that as
Absolutely.
well. Okay.
And that has started. That
Okay.
training has started, including today at noon, because we had the advantage of having them here. So, but we want buy-in from the community, and it's going to start here, because we're going to do a lot of education. We're going to try to convince the community that these are the kinds of changes that we need in order for us to survive, much less succeed. Or we will never build a building big enough to deal with it.
And this is an Hidalgo County situation that we need to all be
Absolutely.
together.
Absolutely.
Because, people work all over. They can live here, but they work, and, if you put 4 or 5 of these shelters out there and they know, people start seeing, that they can go here, there, and wherever, quick and fast. And I don't know, we need to maybe jumpstart it in a way that, everybody realizes that we want to do the right thing for our animal control, humane.
Yeah. Well, from the beginning, we've tried to shy away from just being just McAllen,
No.
Because it definitely won't work.
No.
And it may not work, right? It may not work with all of the cities in Hidalgo County, but by having the representatives that we have here and at least knowing that they have interest, the big cities, Edinburgh, Mission, FAR, McAllen, Hidalgo County, that's the bulk of what Palm Valley takes in. And so that's a great start. And
Westlaco.
FAR actually goes to Westlaco.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Far goes to Westlaco.
No, I mean,
Westlaco,
but I know, but they were, at least they're here, right? They're here listening, and so.
Yeah. Yeah, but what presentation I just gave you, this is for every municipality, right? There's nothing different. But I also wanted to say the other thing about the spay-neuter issue, Faith is organizing a large spay-neuter extravaganza. It's going to be in the fall, in September, about 1,000 animals.
She can do 100 a day, and we're going to do, it's for cats only, it's 100 cats a day that she can do. And we're going to look at doing 5 days for that week, and we're getting Best Friends Animal Society to fund it.
So that'll be
working on that.
500 cats. So one of the other strategies with spay-neuter, when you have limited spay-neuter, is you time the pickup the day before the spay-neuter, so they go out, right away, and they're not waiting in a confinement. So that's another thing.
In each of the communities where you implemented these strategies and practices, was there like a marketing or communication program that was implemented to? I mean, it's great that we're talking about it here, but the core consumer is going to be out there in the neighborhoods who can be able to, read it, understand it, comprehend it,
right?
And then actually execute it.
Right. So I think the most important tools that you can offer your constituents is on your website and when they call, because remember, out of 150, 60,000 residents you have, you're only interfacing with a couple thousand, right? So you don't need to convince or convey to all of them, but it's that one-on-one. And guess what? I might have once in the last 10 years, I needed animal control, and now you can help me, right? And it's a one-on-one. So I'll give you an example. In this community cat thing that I was talking about, where cats don't go into the shelter, they go back, right? That was not done in the United States until 2008 in Jacksonville. And the ACOs thought it was the craziest thing. I thought it was crazy. Nobody, it was a big hullabaloo, right? It ends up, it's working amazing. They're now the national leader. My teammate took 25,000 cats through this program. A few years later, I land in Jacksonville. I go to the Hertz counter. They see a logo on my shirt with a dog and cat, and the Hertz guy says to me, hey, listen, if you see an ear-tipped cat, they're not lost. Don't worry. They're just spayed or neutered. And I was like, oh my gosh, the Hertz guy. Like, this is the culture in their community now. It didn't happen by like, hey, we're doing that. Like, it happened with those interfaces. So what we talked about today was calls go to a pet resource center. How can I help you? What can we do to partner here? And okay, this is an enforcement, goes to an ACO. Okay, you need it to go, right? Instead of just this trigger of punitive enforcement or a trigger to intake.
Got it.
Yeah. So I feel like it's a very focused, and you also, you want to celebrate with your community, you want to celebrate the good things that are happening. I will tell you, with access to spay-neuter, heck, you don't need to advertise, because you'll have lines out the door. You'll have many more people than you could ever fund, unfortunately,
Very good. Thank you.
Do you have outlets or ideas for what some of these communities might have used for maybe a vendor or the software or technology, right, for managing, tracking calls, pickup locations, right? Because I'm not sure exactly what we use. I'm sure we have a system, but I'm sure it's pretty simple. But I think it'd be good, if we're going to start moving in a direction like this, we should also log even where just calls come in, so we can start to see concentrations, cats, dogs, heat maps. You want to see, I think.
Yeah. So Palm Valley uses a program called Shelter Log, and it has a shelter module, but it also has two other things: field services, so that you can get all that data, and it has community points of care. So that's really important. This past weekend was a huge, tons of food was given out for people. Palm Valley's doing vaccines by the thousands in drive-through vaccination clinics and things like that. And all of that information needs to be captured. So that is a great program at shelterloveluv.com, and it has all of those features. And it'd be nice to I shouldn't speak for the shelter, but it'd be nice to be tied in together, yeah. Yeah.
Very good. Any more questions?
No, I think that education is going to be the key. If you're going to do a regional approach, including the rural part of Hidalgo, with Hidalgo County and the rest of the big cities, when we do the outreach and when we do the education, it has to be uniform. Send the same message.
Right.
And then start planning and acting on it. So,
yeah.
I like it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I think we just have enough time to go to executive. No, I'm just kidding.
I think we've got some public comment.
Yes. And being that there are no other items, do we do it now?
Yeah.
I have to adjourn first, the workshop, and then go. So this workshop is adjourned. We're going to jump now to...
This concludes the workshop of the McAllen City Commission. Workshops are held every second and fourth Monday of the month, convening at 4 p.m. at the McAllen City Commission Chamber on the third floor at McAllen City Hall.
Mr. Pesco.
All right, so we're here on the public comment.
Lead band, Juan C. and Key Limes. Children were able to dress up as their favorite book character as they joined the parade and took home some goodie bags. For more information on this event or many